this PowerPoint on empiricism, covering some of Locke's views on his critique of innate ideas, his view that the mind is a blank tablet at birth. Very important in understanding Locke is to understand that for him the word idea is given a whole new meaning. It becomes a technical term for what the mind immediately perceives. In other words, for Locke, our minds are never directly acquainted with the world outside of ourselves. The mind perceives only its own inner ideas. But Locke does believe that you and I are in a real world of real material objects. For Locke, these desks are real, and they were here over the weekend when none of us was here, and they'll be here when we leave. But the problem from Locke's starting point is in justifying that belief. And what Berkeley and Hume after him show is that if you start where Locke started out, it's very hard to justify belief in an external world and a lot of other things in philosophy. So for Locke, the mind is immediately acquainted only with its own inner mental life. As I said, Descartes put us in the egocentric predicament where the mind, or what Locke calls the understanding, that part of us that's aware of the world and what's going on, is acquainted first only with its own inner mental life, its own ideas. But for Locke, some of these ideas really represent things in a real world outside of us, and we're going to see today how he thinks that occurs. But for Locke, we looked last time at his claim that we have two different kinds of ideas, complex ideas, which are really built up of simple ideas. And I use an old-timey telephone to illustrate that distinction. Actually, I was following a text I was using when I made these slides. I have a complex idea of the telephone, and what it is an idea that is composed of simple ideas that relate to the various properties the telephone has. In other words, it includes simple ideas that relate to things like the phone's red color, its shape, it has kind of a squarish shape, rectangular shape. Any feelings like coolness to the touch, if you were to feel the telephone and it felt cool to the touch. The size the telephone has, its number, its weight, its sound if it were to ring. All of these are properties a telephone has, and the simple ideas we have are of these individual properties, but together, again, they come to form for us the complex idea of what we call a telephone. And now here's one of the most important distinctions in philosophy. It was not invented by Locke, and we could go off onto a whole thing about the history of this distinction, but Locke certainly did a lot to popularize it. For Locke, the ideas we have can be said to be ideas of two different kinds of qualities or properties that objects have. Now, it's important that he make this distinction because he's going to claim that some of the properties that we experience in objects aren't really properties of the objects themselves. But while they're caused by objects, they're properties that are subjective and in us. Whereas he's going to claim that, and those would be the secondary properties, but he's going to claim that we live in a world of objects that have real primary properties. And we'll look successively at what those are. Locke knows about the molecular theory. He was personal friends with Newton and Boyle. He knows that various sensations in us are caused by the activity of molecules and how they affect our various sense organs. So he thinks the motion of these molecules produce ideas in us, but he also thinks that some of the ideas we have really resemble the real properties of objects. But other ideas we have, those that relate to what he calls the secondary properties, are just subjective and in us. Secondary properties usually relate to only one sense, like colors, which we would perceive, tastes, which obviously relate to the palate, smells, feelings of heat and cold, sounds. For him, these are subjective and in us. My dad was colorblind. Now, we use the word colorblind metaphorically for someone who is not a racist and doesn't care what color somebody's skin is. But the word literally means that somebody cannot see the kinds of colors that most of us can see. And the MVA has various tests for this. But presumably, now I'm not colorblind in the literal sense. I can see the red light and the amber light and the green light of a traffic light, but presumably when my dad pulled up to a traffic light, his experience of that light was very different from mine, or probably from yours, unless you're also colorblind. In other words, he knew whether the light was amber or red or green. How? How would you know that if you couldn't see the colors? Well, this is one of those things that you never pay attention to, but you know, they're always in the same order, right? So he could tell which light was lit, and that's how he knew to go on green, but he couldn't tell that it was green. This actually worked against us. Dad was the principal breadwinner, and if we had a TV in the house, it was going to be one that he bought. And, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people only had black and white TVs in their homes. I mean, having a color set in your home was a big deal. Now, the only way you could buy a black and white TV is at a Saturday morning, you know, flea market somewhere where somebody had one left over. You can't buy a TV that's not colored nowadays, but it was different back then. And so Dad only bought black and white TVs because he couldn't tell the difference. But anyway, take tastes. I had a housemate in graduate school whose idea of a nice, healthy snack was a dab of cottage cheese on a plate, a toasted English muffin, and half of a green bell pepper that he took the seeds out of. Now, my mother made a dish she called stuffed peppers, where you would stuff half of a bell pepper with a mixture of ground beef, rice, and some other things. When my mother was cooking that dish, I couldn't even go in the house. Just the very smell of a bell pepper makes me gag. Now, obviously, the experience of my ex-housemate who thought that was a wonderful snack, you'd think the smell and taste of a bell pepper must be a different experience for him than it is for me, right? So he says colors, tastes, smells. One of the ways Locke argues for this is by talking about feelings of heat and cold. When I was a kid, my brother and I, like most kids our age, had sleds, right? And there's a hill that's now gotten overgrown with trees, but when we were young, they kept the grass cut enough that if you got some snow, we could take out our sleds and go sledding down this hill, and it wasn't far from the front of our home. And my mother used to buy these gloves at the 5 and 10 that were like knit, really finely knit fabric. And they were never very effective, plus they'd get wet if you were in the snow. So my hands would be pretty cold. So she would call us in for dinner after we'd been out there, my brother and myself. And we had 2 separate spigots. And the cold water spigot was always closer. So I'd turn on the cold water to wash up. And my hands were so cold that the cold water from the cold water spigot felt warm. I don't know if you've ever had an experience like that. But that's what Locke is trying to illustrate here. Say the one on your left has hot water in it. Not so hot that you can't put your hand in it, but definitely hot, like bath water hot, right? And the one on your right has cold water, maybe some ice cubes in it too. But the one in the center either has room temperature or just water that's lukewarm. Now suppose you put your hands in the 2 side buckets. What would happen, and you leave them for a few minutes to get conditioned to the water. What would happen to the hand that was in the hot water if you take it out and put it in the center bucket of the room temperature water? How would the room temperature water feel to the hand that's just been in hot water? Yeah, would feel cold, right? I mean, this is not rocket science, right? You can, but here's the point, though. Suppose you took the other hand, out of the ice water and put it in the lukewarm water. How would that hand feel? It would feel like the cold water spigot when I was coming in from sledding, right? The water in the center one would feel warm. But you can say, well, wait a second. So here's the same water. The same water can't have 2 opposite properties. It can't be both warm and cold at the same time. And this, so we have to either conclude that the same water has 2 opposite properties, which seems an outright contradiction, that exactly the same water, the water in the middle bucket, is both warm and cold at the same time, hot and cold, or we can conclude that heat and cold are not really in the water as properties of the water, but are only in us and are mind dependent. So this is the type of philosophical argument Locke uses to support the claim that secondary properties like colors, sounds, tastes, and feelings of heat and cold are not really properties of objects. Now, he knows that they're caused by objects, the molecules in the water, but they're not in the water, these properties for him. However, what he calls primary qualities or properties for Locke are really in things, and he says our experience of secondary properties don't resemble anything that's really in things in the real world. But look at that whiteboard there. Now for Locke, the white color of that board would be subjective and in us. But note, if we look at it, it's rectangular in shape. And it also is a board of a certain size. Well, and note that on this wall there is one board, and there's a total of 2 boards in the room. Things like that, the shape of something, its size, its number, its location in space, those, Locke says, are primary qualities. And even though my mind is only acquainted with an inner picture of, say, the whiteboard, for Locke, that inner picture, the picture I have of something rectangular really represents the property of being rectangular that the board has out there in the real world. So even though secondary properties for him aren't in the real world, primary properties are. And he says our ideas of them do genuinely resemble them and accurately convey knowledge. In other words, for Locke, even though I never experienced that whiteboard directly, my inner picture, which is a complex idea of it, accurately represents that board to me. So another way of looking at it is, take this table here. Note, from where I am, I have a different experience of this table than the experience you have looking at it head on from the other side or from the side of it. For Locke, what's going on is we each have a different inner picture of the table, and that is what our minds are acquainted with. But even though none of us is experiencing the table directly, all of those inner pictures represent numerically one table in the real world. Now you can say, well, wait a second, I believe I see the table directly, not just an inner picture of the table. What a poor, naive person you are. At least this was the thought of people not only in the modern period. In other words, the thought is that this belief that ordinary people have, that when they look at a table like that, they're seeing it directly, that belief is naive and wrong. A little philosophy and a little science will let them know that they never see the table directly, but they only have an inner image of the table. But for Locke, these inner pictures really represent the table, at least in terms of its primary properties. Now, this view held sway even into the middle of the 20th century, where instead of talking about Locke's ideas or Hume's perceptions, they were instead talking and used a more scientifically sounding term, sense data. But their thought was, our minds are still only acquainted with our inner sense data, and these represent the world to us, but we never are directly acquainted with things in the world. Well, it's good to see people, but as I said, I mean, class starts at 11, not now, but at any rate, so we're finishing up Locke. So he says things like the size, shape, molecular texture, motion in space, these are all primary properties, plus number. Number's a primary property. In other words, there's only one table there. There are two whiteboards in the room. You know, numbers are primary properties of objects. Now, the problem Locke has, well, first of all, you can really understand where Berkeley and Hume are going, and we're not, put away your phone. I already told people don't have them out. Well, all right, if you're photographing, but again, these are available on the internet. So, if you understand that from our inner perspective, from our experience of an object in the world like a telephone, to us, that telephone is a combination of ideas of primary and secondary properties or qualities. Now, for Locke, as we saw, not all of these properties belong to objects in the real world. Like the red color of the telephone is not really in the telephone as a property. It's caused in us by the primary properties of the telephone, by the molecules, etc. But it's not in the telephone as a property. However, the size and shape of the telephone are primary properties. The number of the telephone is also a primary property, and these are really in the telephone as it is in the real world for Locke. You know, now again, this seems like very picayune little distinctions. Why should I even pay attention to them? But the point is, these distinctions gave rise to a skepticism that pervaded philosophy well into the middle of the 20th century, or that philosophers had to deal with. So for Locke, there's a marked difference between appearance and reality. We seem to experience a world of primary and secondary qualities in objects. For Locke, the world has only primary properties. But also, his view is called indirect realism because on a view like Locke's, we never experience things in an external world directly. And this leads ultimately to skepticism. it led to Berkeley saying that only the ideas themselves ever exist. There are no such things as material objects that exist independently of perceivers for Berkeley. And it led Hume to say, well, you know what? There may be a world of external objects that causes the experiences I think I have that relate to them, but we can never justify one way or another whether the experiences we have that seem to be caused by things in a real external world actually are caused by them. So Locke believes we're in a real world, but we never experience it directly. We cannot know the real world directly through our experiences. We know them through representative images. I mean, I see you've got a picture of the former president on your sweatshirt, right? Has anyone ever seen the former president directly in person? Oh, some of you have. Well, that's good. But even if no one had ever seen the president, I went to get my hair cut last week, and I'm just sitting there in this little barber shop in my neighborhood, and the former governor walks in, dressed in jeans and a college sweatshirt. Former Governor O'Malley. Sits down across the room. Nobody pays that much attention because he comes in there regularly, I found out. So anyway, but the point is, even if we had never seen the president or the former governor directly, we think we would know what they look like, right? I recognized him. I've only seen him in person one time before, years ago. But we've all seen representations. So this is Locke's view of how we know things in the real world. That even though we're only acquainted with our inner experience of them, those inner pictures represent things in the real world to us accurately. So we have to infer what the real world is like from our inner experiences, from our ideas. But the problem is this asks us to make a logical leap that philosophy for years could not justify. It leads to skepticism since we perceive only our ideas directly and never know what they represent. And this is an important part of the sentence. We can never compare our ideas with reality to check their accuracy. Now look, this is an old illustration, but I've used this for years. Way back in, I think it was 1990 or 91, I was looking for what then was state of the art, a hi-fi stereo VCR. Even any VCR they're even stopping to make them now. But at any rate, back then it was state of the art. And there was a local electronics store in Charlottesville that was like H.H. Gregg or Best Buy, right? So I went in there more than once because I shopping for this thing was half the fun of it, right? So back then, well, let's back up a little bit. In the 1970s, we used to play backgammon in hotel, bars, and they all had projection TVs. And in the 70s, projection TVs like we have just looked horrible. These people could never get them in right adjustment. The colors were off. The pictures weren't clear. But that's the 1970s. By the 90s, they had gotten better. Now, what passed for big screen TVs back then were modified projection TVs. Right, you've got projection TVs where the screen is external and they project on a screen. But you could buy big screen TVs back then, which actually had a projector inside it that projected onto the back of what looked like a regular big screen, and these were all in one cabinet. And they had a number of these. And they were trying to demonstrate that these actually, unlike the ones in the 70s, had pretty good pictures and represented colors pretty accurately. So the way they did this was they took what passed for a home movie camera back then. I remember one of my relatives had one. You'd put a big VHS tape in a camera that's as big as the ones that you see cameramen walking down the sidelines of a football game with. But they had one mounted on a tripod, and it was pointed at a doll that had a dress on of various colors. Now, suppose you were in that store and you wanted to see whether the picture, and they fed this picture of the doll in all these TVs at once. Suppose you wanted to see whether the picture accurately represented the doll, what would you do? It's not rocket science, is it? You'd look at the pictures on the TVs, and then you'd look at the doll, and you say, well, are the colors accurate? You know, does the doll look like the doll really looks? Is the picture clear? You say, well, why go into all this story? Well, this is the thing. You could tell whether those pictures accurately represented the doll because you could compare the two. On a view like Locke's, the mind can never get beyond its own inner experiences to compare those experiences with things in the real world to see whether or not our subjective experience of the world really relates to the world as it is, or whether it represents anything, whether we're in a dream world, or whether Berkeley's right and there just are the ideas and nothing beyond them. And so a view like this leads to skepticism because we can't get beyond our own inner experiences. So we'll look a little bit at Berkeley and Hume after the test.